Number 1. Vesna Vulovic, girl who survived a fall of over 30,000 feet. Vesna Vulovic was a flight attendant aboard the Yugoslavensky Aerotransport Flight 367. On January 26, 1972, the JAT Flight 367 at 4:01 p.m., 46 minutes after takeoff, there was a huge explosion in the luggage compartment that tore the McDonnell Douglas DC-9 aircraft into 3 pieces. As the cabin lost pressure, passengers and crew were sucked out of the plane, falling 30 feet off to their deaths in freezing temperatures. But Vesna survived. By sheer luck, she got pinned down by a food cart at the tail end of the fuselage. The aircraft's fuselage tore away from the rest of the plane, hurtling towards the ground amidst dense woodland close to the Czechoslovak village of Srpska Kamenice. It made a crash landing in deep snow, a stroke of luck that likely spared Vesna's life. She was later found screaming inside the wreckage by Bruno Hanke, which was another case of sheer luck because he was a local villager and former World War II medic who was able to administer vital first aid before rescuers arrived. Number 2. Tsutomu Yamaguchi, guy who survived being exploded. On August 6, 1945, Yamaguchi was preparing to leave Hiroshima after spending his time there on a 3-month-long business trip for his employer. It was around 8:15 that morning when Yamaguchi was doing his final laps around the factory when he heard the drone of an aircraft overhead. Looking upwards, he saw an American B-29 bomber hovering over the city when it dropped a small object that was connected to a parachute. Suddenly, the sky erupted in a blaze of light. With barely a moment to spare, he leaped into a ditch seconds before a deafening explosion echoed through the air. The force of the blast lifted Yamaguchi from the ground, swirling him like a tornado before flinging him into a nearby potato field. Remarkably, he found himself less than 2 miles from the epicenter of the explosion. With everything settled, Yamaguchi was surrounded by torrents of falling ash, and he could see a cloud of fire rising in the sky over Hiroshima. His face and forearms had been badly burned, and both his eardrums were ruptured. Together with a few other survivors, they resorted to a nearby train station that was still operating to take them to Nagasaki. Yamaguchi and the other survivors reached Nagasaki safely, and he was able to rebound with his family. Despite just surviving a fucking atomic bomb, Yamaguchi reported for work the next day with bandages over his body. It was around 11 a.m. when he was having an argument with the company director about the existence of an atomic bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. As he was thoroughly explaining himself, the landscape outside suddenly exploded with another iridescent white flash. Yamaguchi swiftly fell to the floor mere moments before the shockwave shattered the windows of the office, hurling shattered glass and debris across the room. The atomic bomb that struck Nagasaki possessed even greater destructive force compared to the one deployed on Hiroshima. However, Yamaguchi discovered later that the city's terrain, with its hills and sturdy stairwell structure of his office, acted as a buffer against the full impact of the blast. Despite this, his bandages were torn off, exposing him once again to a harmful wave of cancer-inducing radiation, and again surprisingly, the young Yamaguchi was still alive. He died many years later at 93 years old. Number 3. Aaron Rolston, man who survived after cutting off his arm. In April 2003, Aaron Rolston set out for a solo trip in Utah's Canyonlands National Park. Very boldly and hugely stemming up with excitement, he started climbing one of the canyons. Suddenly, events turned for the worst as a huge boulder, probably weighing around 800 pounds, fell right above him, trapping his right arm in between the rocks. He didn't know what to do at first, as everything he had tried before just didn't work the way he wanted. Even though he already had enough provisions to get him through, the poor Aaron pulled off a Bear Grylls move. Once he ran out of food, he pulled off a Bear Grylls move and decided to drink his own pee.
The only thing I can do is to drink my own pee.
Convinced that he was going to die, Aaron decided to record goodbye messages to his loved ones on his video camera. He also carved his own epitaph into the canyon wall so that people would know when he passed away. Aaron then slept off, and in the process, it's like his own subconscious gave him a solution to survive. As he slept, he had a dream in which he saw himself with one arm, so immediately after he woke up, he decided to break his arm and cut his arm off, bit by bit, with just a 2-inch knife. Alas, he was finally free from the rocks and was able to make it to safety in an ordeal that literally shook the whole world, thereby inspiring the 2010 film 127 Hours. Number 4. Michalina Lewandowska, woman who escaped death after being buried alive. Just like any usual couple, Marcin Kasprsak and Michalina Lewandowska used to live a beautiful love life, and they even had a 3-year-old son. Their relationship was all perfect until one day. Marcin Kasprsak, a bodybuilder known for flexing off his muscles, started getting bored with his wife. Marcin Kasprsak thought the women in the gym looked better. So, together with his friend Patrick Boris, he decided to kidnap her, shoot her with his taser, and forcefully push her inside a cardboard box.
Bruh.
They buried her alive in a remote woodland near Huddersfield. Getting up in shock and finding herself already in the grave, she began to have those dazzling memories of her son and her boyfriend or ex at that point. Then, she remembered the ring she had on. It's the ring itself that would turn out to be her lifesaver. Michalina quickly used it to cut the tape from her legs, and then she used her ring to tear the box apart. She managed to get half of her body out of the ground. She lay on the ground to get her first gasp of fresh air. Eventually, she fully freed herself and she pushed herself towards the highway and stopped a passing motorist who drove her to safety. Later that day, her partner together with his friend were arrested and both were charged with attempted murder. Number 5. Man survived trapped underwater for 3 days. Harrison Oken was a ship cook working off of the coast of Nigeria. As he was working on the ship, a wave suddenly hit the boat, flipping it over, causing it to sink 100 feet below the surface. Luckily for Harrison, he was in the bathroom at the time of the wave. Somehow, the toilet and the position he was in formed an air pocket underneath the water. Within the small air pocket space, he tried to find things that could help him stay alive. A Coca-Cola bottle floated by. He was relying on his faith and a Coca-Cola bottle to get him through. Imagine being trapped underwater in darkness with a dwindling air pocket, no food, and water for up to 60 hours with no clue you would even be found. Divers eventually went to investigate the wreckage and found the bodies of his colleagues before they finally ran into him. Alive, painting, scared, and cold. It was stated that he would have about 19 more hours before the oxygen in the air pocket was used up. After experiencing something like that, he decided to never go back in the water again.
Cap.
Just kidding, he actually became a diver himself, which is pretty cool. Number 6. Man survived being struck by lightning 7 times. Roy C. Sullivan is either Thor, Barry Allen, or God must just straight up hate Bro at this point. Bro was struck by lightning so many times in his life, he broke the Guinness Book of World Records for receiving the most lightning strikes in one's lifetime. Roy Sullivan was a United States park ranger in Shenandoah National Park, and between 1942 and 1977, he was struck by lightning on 7 recurring occasions. You see, one lightning bolt comprises of several hundred million volts, and over 80 years, the odds of being hit by lightning is always around 1 to 10,000, which decrease quite dramatically. But the mathematical odds don't really apply to Sullivan's case because he was at a higher risk. Probably it could be because of the nature of his work and location. Like, for example, Virginia State alone gets an average of around 35 to 50 thunderstorm days per year. Back to Sullivan now. On April 1942, Sullivan's luck took a shocking turn for him. Seeking shelter from a storm in a lookout tower, he became a target for lightning. Without a lightning rod, the tower ignited, forcing him outside where he was struck, leaving a fiery mark on his leg and a hole in his shoe. And as if that wasn't enough for him, he was struck again in July 1969, losing his eyebrows, July 1970, April 1972, August 1973, June 1976, and lastly in June 1977, whereby the lightning decided to set ablaze his grandfathered hair while he was out fishing. The bolt traveled through him and burned his chest and stomach, and miraculously, he was still alive. Number 7. Guy performed self-surgery in Antarctica. In 1961, Rogozov was stationed at a newly constructed Russian base in Antarctica. It was already winter that March, and they were already secluded from the outside world. On April, the 27-year-old Rogozov began to feel a little unwell, and his symptoms were quite discomforting for him. Being the only doctor, he didn't find it difficult to diagnose his condition. It was acute appendicitis, and he knew that if he were to survive, he had to undergo an operation. It was a condition that he had operated on many times, and based on where they were at that time in the middle of a polar wasteland, he realized he was in a very difficult situation that was a matter of life and death. He knew that his appendix was about to burst, and if that happened, it could easily end his life. So, he decided to make the difficult and painful choice of playing the game of operation on himself. He worked out a detailed plan for the operation and assigned his colleagues a duty each would perform. He nominated 2 assistants to hand him instruments, position the lamp, and hold a mirror to help him see what he was doing. The station director was also in the room in case one of the others became faint. Rogozov was so organized that he instructed them what to do if he were to pass out. He administered a local anesthetic to his abdominal wall that quickly numbed the region. He then tried to keep his head awake and clear as possible and did the thing he feared the most. He cut through his skin and opened the peritoneum. Blood was already pooling around him. He grew weaker and weaker at every step he made. He had to rest about 20 to 25 seconds for every 4 to 5 minutes of the operation. Alas, he reached the appendage, and to his shock, the appendix had only a small fraction to burst off if he had stayed a day longer. After nearly 2 hours, he successfully managed to remove the appendix, and before falling back to give himself a rest, he instructed his assistants on how to wash the surgical instruments. It was such a staggering achievement for him that day. You can only but imagine the pain. Number 8. Bear Grylls, man who survived after a parachute incident. In 1996, Grylls was on a solo skydiving trip in Zambia when his parachute malfunctioned at around 16,000 feet or 4,900 meters above ground level. This caused him to crash land on his parachute pack, resulting in a serious injury to his back. He broke 3 vertebrae upon impact, leaving him severely injured and unable to walk. Following the accident, Grylls faced a daunting survival situation. Despite the excruciating pain and his debilitating injuries, he knew he had to take action to increase his chances of survival. He carefully assessed his surroundings and made a decision to crawl to safety. Over the course of several agonizing days, Grylls dragged himself across the rugged terrain, enduring immense pain with every moment. He used all his survival skills to stay alive, including finding water and sheltering from the elements as best as he could. Eventually, after what must have felt like an eternity, Grylls managed to reach help. The shocking part about all this is the fact that Grylls was able to crawl days on end with the sheer weight of his giant balls. Number 9. James Grimes, overboard. On November 23, Grimes boarded the Carnival Valor in New Orleans to spend quality time with 17 loved ones from his mother's side of his family. That night, James took some beers and wines and even won a free drink in an air guitar competition. That would mark his last memory he had with the ship, as after leaving his family at a bar, he fell overboard into the Gulf of Mexico. Bro ended up stranded in the sea with no ship or boat in his sight. He began to make up songs that he sang to himself. That whole night while at the sea, Grimes would experience the worst torture. Talk of the cold shivering nights all alone at the sea, being stung by 2 swarms of jellyfish, and being scared by something that looked like a shark, and as if that wasn't enough, he tried his best to keep himself afloat on the ocean surface, which honestly is quite tiresome. Thanks to his construction work background, he was a fit man. Anyways, the next day, Grimes' sister realized he was missing and reported his absence. This prompted a search and rescue, and then the US Coast Guard began an extensive search. As fate would have it for him, that day in the evening, Grimes spotted 2 ships, and with joy he swam towards them. Since they say hard work pays, Grimes managed to get close enough to a ship only for someone to spot him. A voice eventually yelled out at him, "The Coast Guard is 15 minutes out." Minutes later, a helicopter circled over Grimes. He quickly pulled off his boxers and waved them at them, trying to make sure they saw him. A rescuer then swam to Grimes and put him in a blanket that was airlifted to the helicopter. Number 10. Jose Salvador. It was in November 2012 when Jose Salvador set out on a fishing trip with a day worker, Ezequiel Cordoba. Jose had been fishing for sharks in Mexico for decades, but this exhibition would turn out to be the most dreadful experience he ever saw in his life. So, the two set out to the sea, and just like any other day, they began fishing for sharks. Initially, everything seemed okay, and in fact, they saw success in their trip. Events quickly turned for the worst as a storm began to set in. They ignored this and proceeded to continue their fishing, not knowing that they had just made the worst mistake of their lives. As they attempted to return to land, waves flooded the engine and they drifted out to sea, where they were battered by the storm, losing most of their equipment. The storm didn't stop for almost a week, and by the time it passed, they were completely lost in their small, camouflaged blue and white boat. It was at this moment that their survival skills had to kick in. They quickly collected 70 bottles, which they filled with rainwater to help with their thirst. For the first month, they were feasting on sea turtles and little sharks. As they drifted out further, they became even more creative and devised more cruel means to survive. They would wait for birds to land on their boat, catch them, break off their wings, and store them as their food supplies. Beyond all this, they managed to keep their sanity by using their imagination. They would imagine themselves eating their favorite food and imagine themselves having sex with women. It's their imagination that kept them pushing. As time went by, Jose lost his colleague, and he was therefore left alone, only to be later found in the Marshall Islands in the Central Pacific, about 6,700 miles from where they had set off 438 days earlier. Thanks for coming to my TED Talk. Remember, knowledge is power. Cheers.
Knowledge.